Tonight marks the second year of NAASR's partnership with the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation on this joint lecture series on contemporary Armenian issues. Since last fall, when the series began, we've covered a multitude of topics, including 20th century Armenian literature, the business environment in the current Armenian Republic, contemporary Armenian identity, the Armenian parliamentary elections and their aftermath, the constitutional referendum in Turkey, Nagorno-Karabakh in the aftermath of the April War, Syrian Armenian refugees, and more, with programs here at NAASR, at area colleges in New York, New Jersey, Florida, and California. It's been a very productive partnership, and we're grateful to the Gulbenkian Foundation and especially to Rasmi Panosyan for their support and their interest in our work. On to tonight's program. Because our speaker tonight, Henry Theriault, is a local guy and a familiar face for many of us, as a speaker here and a speaker here at NAASR on several prior occasions and at other venues, there's the risk of forgetting how impressive this guy is. Dr. Henry Theriault was recently, this past summer, elected president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He has served as founding co-editor of the peer-reviewed journal Genocide Studies International, chaired the Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group, which I think maybe was the last time you were here, you spoke about that, and was the lead author of its 2015 final report. And his autobiographical narrative, Out of the Shadow of War and Genocide, was recently included in Advancing Genocide Studies, Personal Accounts and Insights from Scholars in the Field, edited by Samuel Totten, which I haven't read, and I really would like to read that. We don't have it here yet.
I think
but
to me, you'll probably need to give it away.
We'll work on it.
Yeah.
After 19 years on the faculty in the philosophy department at Worcester State University, this year he became Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. There's no getting around it. He's a big shot now. But I remember the first time I heard Henry speak at one of Richard Hovhanessian's conferences at UCLA, where I was also presenting back in 2005. Henry gave a paper, later given as a lecture here, on rethinking, speaking of rethinking, it was on rethinking the idea of dehumanization and the Armenian genocide. I thought it was terrific. Very interesting and thought-provoking lecture, taking a piece of received wisdom and interrogating how it did or did not apply to the Armenian case. And I think this is just the kind of thing that Henry is really, really good at and that we'll benefit from tonight. So please welcome Henry Theriault. What we're going to do is this. I have a few prepared questions or discussion points that I will pose to Henry. But since we want this to be a discussion rather than make the audience wait until the very end, before we move on to each next point, we'll allow for some questions or comments from the floor. Though as ever, I ask you to please make them brief and on topic. And of course, when we reach the end of our discussion, the floor will be open for questions and comments. So, do you want to say anything first?
Just open. Thank you for a way too generous introduction. Many of you know me in real life, so you know that was really fluffed up quite a bit, which I appreciate. But you know, it's on paper, so it's real. Put it on the internet, I'll be all set.
Yep.
I also want to mention, if anyone's checked out the designs for the new building, as hard as this bookstore is to get through without trying to buy something because it sort of sucks you in, they're going to set it up like a duty-free shop for the future, so you have to go through the bookstore and no one gets out without buying something. Is that fair? Yeah. All right, I'm excited for that. The other thing is I have to ask Mark a personal favor. My good friend George Sherinian of the Zorian Institute is in a NAASR-sponsored event this very night in New Jersey.
Do you want to Skype him in?
No, what I wanted you to do is report that more people came to this one than to
Oh, yeah.
We're going to have a big fight.
Way better.
Yeah, tell him way better. He should have just given up and come here. Okay. But I do, in a more serious thing, and I have to say, Marcus was really generous about the 2005 program that I was on at UCLA, he was on, and that's when you gave the Finnegan's Wake talk, which is one of the most brilliant Armenian studies papers. If anyone has not, if you haven't read this, you need to read it. He actually goes through Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce and found the Armenian words in this and determined that Joyce actually integrated Armenian language into his new language that he created in Finnegan's Wake. So I highly recommend it. It's a brilliant paper. I highly recommend you you read this, just from pure love of Armenian culture.
We have that book.
And we have him, yeah. And that, you know, he may get, you know, you cut a good deal with them if you do the right thing. The only other thing I'll say is, just in the spirit of tonight, this is meant as a discussion, not me to say, you know, to talk a long time. I can do it. And if anyone's ever seen me before, you know I can just go forever, and it gets a little boring after a while. Tonight, the point is to discuss things, and part of what makes this attractive for me is that as president of IAGS, I really want to think of ways to move the organization forward. I think we're at a particularly difficult political time in the U.S. and globally. You know, I mean, Tanner can attest to what's going on in Turkey. Anybody who's been, you know, Russia, you know, Netherlands, France, and other places can attest to this. We're seeing a return of the first disappeared, who happened to be an indigenous activist in Argentina in decades, has happened recently. So we're seeing a return to some of the same issues that we thought we had made progress against over the past 50 years, 30 years, 20 years. And so I think IAGS is one of the organizations, NAASR and many others, who really have an impact and can have a public education and advocacy impact against these kinds of things. I want to take your ideas about what IAGS can do in this kind of a climate to try to affect some positive changes, as much as that may seem like swimming upstream right now. So please don't hold back with your suggestions, and you know, hopefully out of this we'll get some productive ideas to move forward.
So building on that,
Yeah.
Henry, in your inaugural speech as president of the IAGS, you declared that, quote, "Genocide studies has been at the forefront of recent human rights advances. Dire political climates in the US, Europe, and other areas threaten this progress. Racism, xenophobia, misogyny, etc. pervade public discourse and drive repressive legal and political regressions the world over. Genocide's prevalence even threatens increase. Against this, a vibrant IAGS is essential. Demagogues attack the sensibilities genocide studies engenders. Our work is a crucial challenge to their propaganda." Can you talk then, continuing on what you were saying, a little bit about what you see in the political climate as a philosopher and as a genocide scholar that is especially worrisome, and what IAGS or other scholarly organizations can do in the face of that?
I'm worried I'm probably going to be going over territory that many of you are well familiar with. I think there's a level of critique of, for instance, the current US administration and certain other political administrations across the world. So I don't want to belabor some of the points, but I think one of the things that we've seen recently that's very disturbing in the US and in other places is a sort of normalization of hate rhetoric. So that it's no longer a situation in which people have views but recognize that publicly advocating them, you know, particularly, you know, outright racist, even fascist / Nazi views, is not acceptable. It's one thing to hold the views, but there is a break when a society doesn't make it comfortable for those views to be presented publicly. And I think we're losing that. You see some of the rhetoric, and you can certainly see it in the Charlottesville case, but more broadly, you see a kind of rhetoric that is sort of unfettered hate speech, and unrepentant, almost proud, you know, to demonize people, to attack people, to dehumanize people, and so forth. And you know, we see that sort of running, you know, from, I'll say, obvious groups to sort of neo-racist target of immigrants, legal, illegal, it doesn't matter, you know, targeting immigrants generally for problems in a society, which is really, Etienne Balibar is a sort of I think a really interesting postmodern philosopher who wrote in the early 90s about neo-racism, and what he argued that anti-immigrant racism, he's writing particularly in France, in the French context, but it really applies more broadly. Anti-immigrant racism is where the new racism has gone. And what we were seeing in the 90s, and we're still seeing it, I think, in different forms now, was a replacement of old forms of biological racism that were discredited through the discrediting of Nazism, through civil rights in the US, and through other changes, I think, globally, around, you know, the way we think about race and so forth. But anti-immigrant racism and certain other related kinds of things are not biologically based, they're based in concepts of culture and integration and crime and other kinds of things. And we're starting, I think, that rhetoric is really disturbing. But the other thing that's really disturbing is we're seeing now a really broad brush with this kind of hate speech. So maybe it starts with immigrants, and then next it's assaulting, you know, women who are public figures. It's assaulting people along, you know, sort of traditional racial lines, sexuality lines, and beyond, you know, and on and on and on. So that there's a sort of, again, this sort of broad level at which rhetoric that is vilifying particularly vulnerable groups is not only acceptable, but often encouraged, inflamed, and becomes a badge of honor. And I think, again, looking at just the footage of Charlottesville, which is a good example of this, you get to see these kinds of attitudes up close. So I think that's the first thing. And I do think there's a difference between speech and action at some level, but I think anybody who studied genocide in any careful way or other kinds of mass violence understands that speech and violence are very, very related, right? So just because the speech today is not directly violent, and maybe saying violent things is not directly violent, very typically the trajectory of mass violence is that the speech today that gets normalized lowers the bar of resistance going forward. This is maybe Erwin Staub had written about this in the 1980s as a social psychologist, really important. Lowers the bar and normalizes a kind of attitude that makes violence much easier. And you get individual violence, and we're seeing that I think in the United States and in other places. You get individual targeted violence, you get sort of what's considered extremists doing, you know, targeted attacks in different places. And after a while, when that becomes normalized, you start to see much more consistent mass violence. And we're partway along. If we had a, you know, people have been doing the nuclear war scale. I can't remember. The Union of Concerned Scientists has a you know, the doomsday clock, and now we've moved closer recently to that because of various things that are happening domestically and internationally. And I think if there were a similar kind of coding system for genocide globally, I would say generally in the world today, we are closer to more genocides than we have been in a while. And that's saying a lot because I'm pretty cynical about these things, and we've had constant genocide for really centuries if you look at it. But I think we're at a point where we're going to see more frequent genocides, and when you start to factor in other issues, environmental problems that are now looking like they're going to be accelerated again. You look at Alex Alvarez's recent work on environmental issues in their relation to genocide, particularly looking at Sudan, places like that, where increased desertification, which is a function of global warming, actually was a causal factor in some of the genocidal violence that occurred. Not to take blame away from the perpetrators, but to understand the dynamics that are particularly bring in average people who are facing difficult economic and even basic survival resource issues, the way that they can be brought into a genocidal project more easily because of things like global warming should be alarming for us. I don't know if that answers the question, but definitely I'd like to open it up to your ideas. And I did want to say also, I almost feel like I shouldn't be up here given some of the people that are in the audience, or all of you. I'm so thrilled at who's here and what you'll bring to the table, so I hope you'll share freely without any hesitation, and I'm happy to be as quiet as I need to be to let your ideas come up, because I think they'll be really productive. So.
Yes, Gerard.
When you shared your concerns about recent political events here and abroad, do you know, and you said, you know, we're closer to genocide. Actually, it's happening in Syria, for instance, already, and things we didn't hear about before, you know, Christians targeted for the last 70, 80 years. But within those, do you see with genocide, technically it's defined by organized extermination. Do you see the difference between the institutions, let's say governments, international institutions, United Nations, what they do to prevent that versus, for instance, here, a cop shooting an African American 3 bullets, but that's not a step within genocide. We don't expect, you know, the Boston PD to go genocidal just because they killed 2-3 people in the last year versus an organized governments or organized, if it's not governments like ISIS, it's an organized group that's openly seeking to destroy versus racism that's reaching violent levels but not within.
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess what I would argue, I would say a couple things. One is, I think globally, You're right, there's a lot going on. I think if anyone's looking at Burma right now and the Rohingya, and I have to say, I get sort of sickened by these ironies, but Aung San Suu Kyi, who's Nobel Prize winner and all this kind of stuff, is completely indifferent to what's happening to Muslims, and it's very important. One of the groups that has not typically religiously been seen as particularly genocidal or ideologically genocidal are Buddhists, right? And that certainly in the case of Sri Lanka, that came into a lot of question. But what you're seeing right now is a Buddhist-run military that is targeting a minority group, and actually multiple minority groups, but particularly the Rohingya. And maybe our frameworks aren't even really looking at that very carefully. So I think you're right that we're seeing a lot of very serious situations right now. Certainly ISIS and other groups in the Middle East, but ISIS particularly. Great article by Anderson and Murati in the Genocide Studies International issue, I think a couple issues ago, that really gets, using survivor testimony, eyewitness testimony on what's going on right now in Iraq, make a pretty compelling case that we're seeing a genocide by ISIS against Yazidis and other groups. And it's one that doesn't, that fits classic patterns, I think, which are really disturbing. But at the same time, I'm not willing, I think what I want to do is not disconnect our everyday experience from these kinds of what we'll call full fruition of genocide. I think we want to be very careful in the United States to say, well, we're not genocidal, we can't do this, because the reality is, that's what people were saying in the 1920s in Germany. Germany, an advanced country, the best philosophy, I'm sort of prejudiced about that, I think they have great philosophy, a highly developed medical field, right, which became a huge part of the Holocaust. And many other ways in which people thought Germany could never go for the kind, could never elect Hitler, which was the first step, but could never go in for the kind of mass violence that was typically attributed to barbaric civilizations. And within a few short years, that's exactly what happened. And I'm not saying that the US is headed toward genocide, but I'm also not saying we're not. And I think part of not seeing the US and certain other societies, and maybe many other societies right now that are sliding on this trajectory, not head in that direction, is that we take seriously the possibility. 3 black men, killed today is 100 next week, and is 1,000 in a month, and we have to be very careful about how easy it is to slide down that road. That's not saying we're there, and it's not saying that I ever want to compare the kind of violence that you were referencing to an actual genocide. And also I want to stress, even if what happens in the United States doesn't become genocidal, that doesn't mean it's not bad, right? We can repress human rights in all sorts of ways. A lot of people can die. You can look at lynching in the US 100 years ago, and that's, you're talking about 10,000 people overall who were killed in a relatively short time. Maybe not on the scale of the Armenian Genocide, but still a huge crime against humanity. So I guess that's where I would say is that I don't want to leave any of this stuff out, because I think it's all important for us to be looking at. And I think as people here in the United States, where we can have an effect, even in what we say, even when you hear somebody say something ridiculous about immigrants. Come on, you're in a crowd of Armenians, Turks, and others. All of us have immigrant roots in the U.S., bottom line, And so to be thoughtful when you hear someone say something that's really unacceptable and that could lead to changing attitudes, to maybe stand up and say, my family were immigrants, and we came here and people said the same stuff about us, 100 years ago. Something like that, just to intervene, may actually have an effect. But there are more substantial things we can do as well.
How can you prevent genocide when there is politics involved? And what I mean by that is, for example, ISIS, United States provided the ammunition for them to do what they did, supported them. Same with the genocide in Rwanda, in 3 months they killed 900,000 Tutsis with machetes, and Clinton looked the other way, and then 10 years later said, I'm sorry. Right. So how do you prevent when there's politics involved?
Well, there's always politics involved, but I think you mean real, state politics, like self-interest and these cynical agendas, right? And there is no good answer for that. Some of my colleagues, Herb Hirsch among them, was written quite a bit about the issue of how you challenge sort of state interests with ethical concerns. Is pretty cynical about this, right? It is a real challenge. And I'm going to go to some things maybe I've written before that I still believe, which isn't true, you know, we learn and develop, but I think these things are still relatively valid. The first thing is, there's this sort of myth that political interest and power and economics sort of determines the world, and in the face of that, groups of people getting together and trying to change things have no effect, right? Because how can how can a group of people who thinks it's wrong for a corporation to go into the Congo and sort of pay off gangs that are, raping 9-month-old babies and things like this to get minerals that are used for cell phones, right? How could we stop that, right? And you can talk about, boycotting, and there are mechanisms, but the bottom line is, it's really true that they have a lot of power, there are a lot of interests that support them, US government, other governments do that, but if we don't make an effort, we're giving them the field. We're allowing those interests to have full range. At the same time, it's not that this is always successful, it really isn't, but we have seen changes brought on because people refuse to give in to that interest politics. There are obvious examples, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X in the US. As much as we see racism today, as much as we see an unfinished trajectory of civil rights, things did change in a big way. If you look at India in 1920, with total, sort of high point of British colonization, who would have thought by 1950 there would be an independent India? Now, let's be clear, it's a problematic India. You have a Hindu nationalist right now who targets Muslims and others in India, with violence. You have a lot of problems like that in India. You have the Pakistan-India split and all the, the problems of that. But few would argue that at least having an independent India is better than having a colonized India. And maybe some people would argue that that's another issue. If that makes sense. And that wasn't people who had power. It was people without traditional power who refused to give in and kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and triggered, in one sense, I think both in the United States and Britain, triggered the moral sort of commitment of average people who, as they found out what was happening and what was at stake, realized that they needed to change what their state was doing. I'll give one other example, and I hope I'm answering this okay. I'll give you one other example that I think is really important. I don't know if anybody knows Congressman McGovern from Worcester, knows who he is. And he's a very interesting person because he was actually going to Central America, particularly El Salvador, in the 1980s when the U.S. was doing some of the worst manipulative intervention, including supporting death squads that were raping and killing nuns, and you're familiar with this history. And he was working for Congressman Joe Moakley at the time, who was very strong, really strongly trying to stop U.S. arms and other support for these repressive regimes that were violating human rights left and right, and really, in significant ways, as we're probably well familiar with. Well, Congressman McGovern, I give him a lot of credit, really carried those experiences forward. And if you'll remember, in 1998-99, we had what we'll call the East Timor Genocide. I consider it genocidal, some people debate a little bit, but I think it's pretty clearly genocide. From 1975 forward, Indonesia, essentially as Portugal, it's a complicated case, but Portugal had colonized this part of this island, the east side of Timor, East Timor, and because of various issues in Portugal, didn't have the power to sort of continue its arrangement, was going to grant independence in the mid-70s. But Indonesia, because of oil politics and other reasons, stepped in, partly through proxies and partly through its own military, and unleashed a campaign of terror against the 750,000 people on the east side of that island who wanted independence. And not only killed, the numbers go up to about 250,000 out of 750,000, mass rape camps, the whole, forced starvation, the whole sort of typical genocidal pattern. Things continued, but after the 70s, there were some massacres. Things were sort of stable. The UN stepped in, and in the late 90s, there's supposed to be an independence referendum. And leading up to that, Indonesia and its proxy forces again started committing violence. Thousands of people were killed. And we had a moment going into 1999 where it really looked like the second phase of the genocide was going to happen, that there was no way Indonesia was going to allow independence. People knew that the East Timorese were going to vote for independence. Why wouldn't you? You're in under the government of a perpetrator who killed somebody from every family. But what happened was, at that time, the US, Australia, and Britain were supplying the government of Indonesia with its arms, were supplying diplomatic cover in the UN and elsewhere, basically were profound enablers. And Congressman McGovern and two other political leaders, whose names escape me now, so I'm thinking about talking to them, went to East Timor and talked with East Timorese. And it's a brilliant model of genocide prevention. They said, what can we do to support you so there's no genocide? Right? That doesn't happen a lot, right? People just figure we know what to do and they jump in, and oftentimes it's not a good solution. They asked them, and the answer that Congressman McGovern gives was, call off your dogs. What did that mean? Stop supporting the government that's doing this to us. Stop giving them the bullets that are killing us. And McGovern and others came back to the US, were able to get the ear of Bill Clinton, and there's a lot of geopolitical stuff that enabled this to happen, so I don't want to discount that. Australia was worried about a refugee crisis, because if there were more killing, they were right there, and they were worried about a lot of East Timorese coming down, that they couldn't handle the relatively small population in Australia. You know, the US was rethinking its foreign policy in the post-Cold War era, where Indonesia had been a strong anti-communist force, and so forth. So there was a little opening, but they were able to get to the ear of the Clinton administration, and ultimately the three countries that were supplying and supporting withdrew, and there was no genocide, and East Timor became independent, right? So it is possible that these things can happen. A big part of why that happened is because people over decades have been organizing around East Timor issues, you know, and getting the ear of political leaders. And there were people like Congressman McGovern in Congress who knew the issue and who were not willing to stand by silently, right? But they don't necessarily, you know, a lot of political leaders, they're not going to take on issues unless we're talking to them and we're telling them how important it is that they take on these issues. It's a long-winded answer, but those are maybe some possibilities to think about prevention. So sorry.
Lerna, you had a...
Thank you. I want to go back to what you said before the last question. When you were talking about us as immigrants, Armenians, Turks, and others, and like you made a comment that we are all immigrants, everyone has immigrant roots, but of course that startles us in the sense that there are indigenous people.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But I want
to
I want to connect that to your new role
Yeah.
and the associations, International Association of Genocide Scholars take on. I don't know if there are takes, like I don't know how the association operates, but where does it stand, the indigenous genocide or American or Canadian role in uprooting these people, ethnic cleansing, whatever, and what is your take on it?
Let me stand corrected, and I appreciate your intervention. Let me say two things. One is I was thinking, okay, it's an Armenian and primarily Armenian and Turkish audience, so coming from our backgrounds, whether, you know, 10 years ago or, you know, 100 years ago, people are coming in. But that's assuming people aren't mixed. I supposedly have a tiny bit of Native American blood, which doesn't mean anything in particular. And other people, I'm sure, in the United States, it's very, you know, there's so much intermixture that there are a lot of people who are part, you know, different groups, so it's hard to generalize about people. But I would never identify as, you know, I'd never make any claims about being Native American. I think most people in this room probably wouldn't do that. So that's where I was going. Beyond that, of course, in our society, huge numbers of ignored Native Americans, right? I mean, there's all sorts of cases. I mean, you look at the U.S., Canada, Australia. I mean, Australia, the classic problem they've had is they actually believed in the 1840s to the 1870s, actually even a little bit earlier, that they had eliminated all Tasmanians from the island of Tasmania. And it's only been in the last 30 years people have realized, Tasmanians have come forward, basically generally mixed race, but identifying as Tasmanians have come forward and said, no, actually you didn't wipe us all out, and we want rights, and we want our rights, we want reparations, and it was a big shock for people. So even where we don't see indigenous people, I've heard people comment in Massachusetts, oh, there's no indigenous people. Well, that's completely false. I mean, beyond. They have a different public presence than you might get in Washington State or in the Dakotas, those places where Native American groups are more sort of organized and also, I don't want to say this, cohesively geographically located in the sort of East Coast because of the length of time that oppression has been happening and genocide has been happening. People are more dispersed, also because of the longer period. It's much harder for Native American people on the East Coast to establish their lineage, which is one of the things you have to do with the U.S. government. in order to be recognized as Native American than it is for people whose experience with the US government is from the 1850s or 1890s and so forth. So we discount a lot of people as Native American even though they really are Native American because of the way the US government manipulates identity categories and proof of identity. So those are really important things. IAGS, as any organization, there's very few sort of non-specifically indigenous organizations, institutions, or anything I think around the world who adequately deal with indigenous issues. And they are, I mean, I think the 21st century, if I could label it something, maybe it could be the century of, you know, indigenous reckoning or something like that, where we actually start to deal with the last 5 centuries in particular of destruction, genocide, enslavement, colonization, and so forth against indigenous people.
And do you think Armenian Genocide Studies can be...
You can tap that, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
than the
And,
others in terms of connecting.
and there's I think work to be done
Yeah.
in terms of sort of colonial, like conquest colonialism, settler colonialism, which is a big topic. In terms of IAGS specifically, a number of people, Andrew Wolford, who's the immediate past president, and many other people in the organization are actually specialists on Native American genocide. Andrew's from Canada and does a lot of work on Canadian genocide of indigenous people, but many other people. I mentioned Alex Alvarez, who has a book recently on Native American genocide, although it's, he presents a complicated case, but yeah, I know, I should say it's a complicated case, but at least people are studying it. You know, Clark, I want to say 2006, was it October 2016, November? Clark University hosted a really great a day and a half conference on Native American genocide, which also had its moments of controversy over whether to use the term genocide and so forth among Native American scholars. So it was really interesting. You co-sponsored that, right, Master? You were involved with that? No, okay, maybe that was a different thing. You co-sponsor a lot of things, so it's hard to keep track. So I would argue that yeah, so there are a lot of people in IAGS that are very committed to it. One of the problems with IAGS, and I've run into this in my past operations, Connor I think has dealt with this as well, is that it's very tricky in an open scholarly organization for the organization to take a particular stand when people within the organization might take different positions, right? I'm very clear, Native Americans, indigenous people, I mean, we're seeing the Rohingya right now, I mean, you know, pick your area, indigenous people have been targeted with, whether it's particularly genocide, colonization, mass violence, mass removal, forced prostitution, whatever it is. Everywhere you go in the world, there were indigenous people who have been, you know, displaced, destroyed, and so forth. But there are scholars who disagree with approaching things that way, right? And so it's hard to get a consensus. And as an organization that's not specifically a political organization, that wants to retain a scholarly sort of credibility, that it's not, and I say just an advocacy organization, don't get me wrong on that, but it's not an advocacy organization in a way that undermines the credibility of the scholars in it, so that people have to, number one, toe a certain line to be in the organization, and number two, that once an organization takes a certain approach, you know, then everybody in that organization is associated with that approach and sort of doesn't have the latitude to raise questions, which can be very productive. Does that make some sense? And so I think one of the things that we're doing, we're looking at how we pick conferences, how we place conferences, and how we accept bids for conferences. We have conferences every 2 years that are sort of big global gatherings. And one of the things that we're instituting going forward is that in calls for proposals, there has to be part of the proposal indicating how indigenous people from the area are integrated into the program and how their issues are part of the theme of the program, and ways in which, you know, positive actions are taken to actually make it possible for people to participate in meaningful ways. I think that's happened in different ways, you know, in different conferences in different places, but your point is well taken. That's something that has to be front and center in the structure of the organization. So, another long-winded answer.
I'm not sure if this is like in your realm of study or IAGS, but I was wondering if you have any opinion about you were talking about like modern day today social and political forces that are driving us in the direction towards genocide. The impact of like technology and social media and how connected we are, because you could say it's good because people can find out more things and have easier access to their political representatives, or it could be a way for those racist people to find each other and make groups and legitimize each other's ideas. So.
Great question.
Well, actually, that's a great answer, not just a great question. I think you got to the heart of the issue. I'm an old guy, so I grew up before there were I actually grew up with rotary telephones, right? You guys remember those? Okay, so it's a different world.
In New
Okay?
Hampshire, though.
In New Hampshire, and party lines. Do you know what I mean? Now, people would love a party line because you could broadcast all, whatever, it's like Facebook unintentional, centuries ago. And if you don't know what party lines are, get on the internet and look those up. That's not a party like everybody's happy that they're on it. But anyway. So I think just because of my age and because of fear of, getting older and everything, I'm always a little bit like, well, yeah, technology, that's not, it doesn't change things fundamentally. But I do think technology is a tool. It changes, definitely cognitively, how we interact with the world. There's no doubt about it that we see the world through a digital lens a lot now. I mean, there are times I've gone to art museums, and I hate myself for this, but I'm so excited, oh, that's a really cool thing. So I'll take a picture, and it's like I'm not interacting with the art directly, it's always through my cell phone. That cursed thing that I carry everywhere. So it's even changed the way we actually, psychologically, cognitively engage the world around us. And it also is a tool that, as you say, has opened up all sorts of possibilities for a connection. Either Descartes or Plato, or maybe both of them, once wrote that intelligence in itself is neither good nor bad. It can be used for the best purposes or the worst purposes. Technology is the same way, right? It doesn't, I don't agree with people who think just because there's technological advance, bad things happen. The Holocaust didn't happen just because there was the technology to commit the Holocaust, because there were places where that technology existed and there wasn't a genocide, right? The Armenian Genocide, there was a point where people were talking a lot about telegraphs and how that had a role in the genocide. It didn't happen because there were telegraphs. Those were a tool that were used for organizing. That might have increased the extent. It might have increased how easy it was to pull people in, right? Mass media, radio in the case of Rwanda was an important organizing tool. But I do think that absent that, there are always other tools available. So it's not the determining factor. But intervening against the use of technology. So in the case of Rwanda, one of the big debates outside of Rwanda was whether to jam the radio station that was issuing, not just hate speech, but was also actually directing actions in the genocide itself, was saying so-and-so is going down this street, kill that, Tutsi, and I mean at that level of directing genocidal action. And the US, out of this bizarre, really poor idea of what free speech is, said, oh, we can't jam that, that's free speech. I mean, no one thinks that directing a genocide is protected speech. It's not protected under the US Constitution, nowhere. But that argument was used as an excuse not to intervene. So we had the technology to actually intervene against technology that was used. And so that's what I would say. We have to, I think it's great to be very aware of what new technologies allow, how they're used for organizing, how the pitfalls. I don't want to, I want to single out ISIS, but also not single out ISIS, because I think it's misleading to think they're the only problem in the world. That's sort of the rhetoric in the US. I guess North Korea and Iran are in there now after the UN speech of a couple days ago. Maybe they're always there. But if you look at how they recruit, they use the internet really effectively. For people who are against sort of Western values, they use it very effectively, and they know how to use Western technology. And so if we're ignoring that, because we don't think, if I didn't think technology had any impact at all, then that's an important intervention tool that's gone. So that's a long way of just saying that you're right, and I just added some other stuff to make myself look good. So good job.
Yes,
Thanks for coming.
Esther, you had a
Oh,
question?
sorry.
I wanted you to comment more on the youth and kind of seeing these nice young college folks here and the nice comment about social media in the way that.
Could you speak up, please?
Sure, in the way that commenting on the youth and how youth were kind of corralled through Hitler and the Hitler Youth Program. Do you see any patterns of that happening in this country with the way some young folks seem to be desensitized to what's happening?
Not the nice college students who are here.
No, not
I actually see things the other way. If you look at the recent election in the U.S., demographically, the people who were most, I won't say immune, but who were most opposed to the kind of rhetoric that was being, the sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric, the anti-GLBT, anti-gay rhetoric that was very prominent, were younger people. That doesn't mean there aren't, it's a huge, what are we talking, 75, 100 million people in the US. Obviously there are a lot of people who have all sorts of different views. But demographically, I think they, overall were probably the sort of, and this is the thing that's sad, the sort of 13 to 25-year-olds, but unfortunately the first part of that group couldn't vote, were the most progressive element in the US overall. And so I think that if you look at young people, you'll see probably a lot more openness to talking about these kinds of issues. We have a great educator here. Education actually does matter. Like when I talk to my students, I could see a difference over 20 years of teaching. When you talk about genocide in 2015, it's a big difference from 2000. There's sensitivity to issues. There's, you don't have to explain what stereotyping is. You don't have to explain what scapegoating is. You don't have to explain, what identity is, the ways that identity can get manipulated. You don't have to explain what fascism is or authoritarianism in the way that you used to have to, because there's a vocabulary, there's an educational process that has had a huge effect.
You can Google them now.
What's that?
You can Google them now.
Yeah, and that is true. People can learn about these things. They can also get on neo-Nazi sites and things like that, which is an issue. But even there, if you look, there's a lot of critical media education. I mean, one of the things at Worcester State that a lot of the people in the communication department and other departments do is work with we have programs with our librarians to talk about how you decide what a good internet source is and what isn't, right? So people can be really sophisticated. So I would say, in that sense, maybe looking at what some young people are actually doing in the United States might be a good model for us, maybe older folks, to think about organizing. I'm probably not going to do it technologically as savvy, but I think there's a lot of potential there. One of the concerns I have in the United States, I think, maybe those who are following Turkey would have a similar thing to say about the constitutional change. I don't want to get on too much on my soapbox about Armenia, but I see it, the huge corruption, political problems, oppression there as well, and you just go Russia, you just keep going everywhere, I think, around the world. You see these things. One of the problems I'm worried about is we were reaching a critical point, and I'm not an optimistic person about political progress, but I think we were reaching a point where in recent decades there was a real shift. You can see this especially, I think, on some gender issues, GLBT issues, you can see that, say, in the United States. There was a real shift. So that demographically, a critical mass of the population, for instance, doesn't think it's evil to be gay, in the United States, right? And that's not true going back historically, right? So there was a shift. And what I'm worried about is, right now with this right-wing movement, they're working the political system in such a way that certain structures are going to change enough so that that critical mass will not have the power to protect the rights of minorities and different groups. So that would be my big concern. But my hope is they're just not going to accept, younger people with energy and insight are not going to accept that, that they're still going to push against it. So we'll see in 3 years, I guess.
Melissa, and then I want to slightly change the subject.
Hope that's not too long.
You're good. Melissa.
I want to go back to Naina's comment, but to bring up maybe a little different discussion.
Why don't you stand up, Melissa? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We can give you a mic.
Of course. So I want to go back to this comparison between Native Americans and Armenians to bring up another discussion. I adore the work of Glenn Cotard, who is a Canadian Native scholar who wrote a brilliant book on rejecting the politics of apology and recognition. So and he actually, he gives a long and detailed and very critical, very nice account of how politics of reconciliation is a very corporate Cold War, strategy. Basically promoted by the West to actually, so he gives an account of how it all started with the Bosnian genocide and how US basically sold peace to the Balkans, to the post-Soviet world. So what do you think, and what is your take on the apology campaigns. Actually this connects to
Yeah.
Marc's work because he wrote
Yeah.
brilliant articles about this. I mean, maybe because to remind the audience, Glenn Cottard's work is about how Canadian government apologized
Yeah.
for residential schools while not even like mentioning the fact that Canada is still on native land. So they apologize something that the residential schools actually, like the survivors are all dead for something. I mean, he argues that like apology is maybe the last step of colonization, last step of
No.
genocide. So
Yeah.
what do you think about all this reconciliation and
It's a little bit
apology?
out of IAGS and getting into my own particular views, which I've written about and share a lot of Marc's views and appreciate some of the work that he's done on this topic and others have done as well. What I'll say is two things. One is I've certainly changed in 20 years of dealing with speaking particularly about Armenian genocide issues from the perspective of an Armenian, although not, I don't think, sort of a little bit outside the community in many ways, but I've certainly changed a lot in terms of how I view Turkish people, progressives, other people, how I see the future of common cause, things like that. And so on that level, I think there is, I mean, you need to be realistic. As my wife once said when I was upset, she bought a product from Turkey many years ago, and I said, I should buy something from Turkey. And she laughed at me, she said, is that what every Vietnamese should be saying about the United States? Or, and once you start going down those kinds of roads, right, where it's a very simple kind of approach, it's a problem. So I think there's a lot of room within, respectful discussions, respectful interactions for people to develop sort of on all sides. That said, that's very different from the structural issues. And that's where we start to get into it. And I don't want to take up too much time with this. I'm happy to give you stuff. I've written other people even better things other people have written. But when you start to talk about long-range group viability, it's a justice issue not just in terms of historical justice, but for Native Americans especially. And I think that's where one of the differences between the conditions of Native Americans, say, in the United States and Armenians in the United States comes in, is that Armenians, as much as I think Armenia has a very precarious existence right now that has a legacy from the genocide, that Armenians in Turkey are, subject to the same regime and share maybe a lot with Native Americans in the U.S. That's not the case of typical Armenian Americans. We're not, I don't feel like people are harassing me on the street. I don't feel like someone could actually, sexually assault or otherwise somebody in my family and I can't do anything about it. It's a big difference. And so I would say I would be very careful, how you would play out that. I think there are some issues in the causation of the parallel sets of genocides that connection could be useful for. But then going back to your question, I think when you start talking about structural issues, it's not just historical justice, it's whether victim groups are viable for the future. I think that is an open question for Native American group after Native American group, after Australian Indigenous group, after First Nation group, after, the Mapuche, I mentioned the Argentina case. The guy who was killed, who was disappeared, I'm sorry, not killed, it's not confirmed, who was disappeared, by government forces, was a Mapuche, who's the indigenous people on the border, sort of the border area between Chile and Argentina, who were targeted in the late 19th century for extermination on a U.S. model of expansion and destruction. And they were peaceful demonstrations protesting the fact that the government has been giving massive amounts of indigenous land to wealthy landowners like the guy who founded Benetton and others who's an Argentine. Protesting this because they need the land, because they have no way to have a viable community without land. And he's disappeared, there's all sorts of repression. And so in that context, having a nice conversation at a table is not dealing with those structural issues. If you're not changing land politics, for instance, in Argentina, no amount of getting along well, no amount of committees, no amount of apologies is going to allow that community to survive. Does that make sense? So I can talk, there's a lot more to say about that. I'm happy to talk after, but that's the basic idea. And I do think Armenians in Turkey face that situation. I think the Armenian Republic in very complicated ways, even in terms of immigration, faces the economic and political consequences of genocide as well as Sovietization and other things. And those should be taken into account in a similar way.
So, shifting slightly then,
Please.
but not much from what you just said. Today is, of course, Armenian Independence Day, one of them. The day Armenia declared its independence in 1991. So it might seem strange to have a program focusing on genocide studies on this day, but I don't know that it actually is. So we often hear that the Armenian genocide happened a long time ago, and it is not necessarily relevant today, and that the focus should be on the Armenian state and not on what happened 100 years ago. But in your work, you explicitly link the two things, and I wanted you to talk about this a little bit, the links you see between the genocide of 100 years ago and the fragile state of the Republic today.
Yeah, that's another long answer, so I'll try to keep it
Let me get
brief,
comfortable.
and you can, you can just throw something at me when I get to that critical point where people start walking out. Let me say that this is not unique to the Armenian case, thanks for that. It's not unique to the Armenian case, and really, one of the big, I think, challenges in understanding not just genocide issues politically in terms of current events, but human rights issues more generally, is stopping the violence, or the end of the violence, is just the beginning of the process of dealing with it, right? So, I used Argentina as an example, right? So Argentina is still going through, and that's part of why we're seeing a backlash now with the right-wing movement there, probably because of the global political situation is also enabling that. Argentina went through multiple processes of trying to come to terms with the military dictatorship of 1976 to 83. Sets of trials at different points. It just went through a process of the best set of trials, 40 years after what happened, essentially, 35 years. And it is still now has a right-wing movement that's undoing a lot of the gains that were made. People are afraid again in ways that they hadn't been for a decade or two. And some of the same people are coming back into power and fashion and things like that. There's now, a lot of denial over what happened and the abuses of human rights and so forth. It's being presented very familiar to an Armenian audience as a civil war, not a terror instituted by a military dictatorship, right? So there are all these things kind of happening. So things don't end with the end of the initial violence. Not only is there potential for more violence unless something is done, but the effects can be devastating. You mentioned, indigenous people, and I think that's one place where you see it starkly. In a complicated way, go look at Pine Ridge Reservation in the U.S. and you can see the effects of genocide. 137 years after the last, quote-unquote, actual military action by the U.S. government against the people there, right? It's evident. Incredible poverty, incredible intergenerational trauma, which results in alcoholism, abuse, lack of legal rights, right? I mentioned before, Native Americans do not have the same rights that everybody else has in the United States. White folks and others can go onto reservations and commit crimes, and the legal framework is very complicated to say the least, and has essentially ensured impunity for very serious crimes, most notably sexual assault, which is widely a problem for Native Americans by whites going to reservations. And so you see that kind of problem, right? So in all these dimensions, these are contemporary issues, right? So the things that need to be dealt with. In the Armenian case specifically, economically, I think it's hard to argue that the Armenian genocide did not have a huge economic impact on Armenians. And you can point, as with the case of many Jews in the Jewish diaspora, you can point to people who made it, and maybe a lot of people who made it, right? Who recovered, who are fine. I don't think of myself as much as, economics in the current US is not great. I don't think of myself as someone who's destitute because of the genocide, if I can say it that way. But if you look around the world at different places, and you can see this among, and this is where stereotypes are incredibly dangerous. You can see it among many Jewish communities globally. They are not wealthy. They are vulnerable in different ways. You see this with Armenian communities. You see this with the Armenian Republic, a very economically challenged area, right? A population that's economically challenged. Now, don't get me wrong. Sovietization had some positive things and also some negative things. And I would say if you look at the current state of Armenia, and I know there are experts here who can speak to this better than I can, and maybe have a very different view, But if you look at what's happening in Armenia today, yes, corruption, yes, the legacy of the Soviet Union and all that is there and has a big effect on the economic problems in Armenia. But there's also a big legacy of the genocide in terms of land availability, in terms of impoverishment of a population that was never able to recover the economic basics that it needs, right? You can see this. Someone had mentioned you mentioned ISIS and Christian minorities. You can see this. I mean, Assyrians. By the way, we talk about Armenians. Assyrians have it. Think of it as even worse, right? In terms of their vulnerability, in terms of the scattering, in terms of the situation they're in. But if you look at groups like that under ISIS, right, in Iraq and in Syria, and maybe in Lebanon, the vulnerability of those communities, the fact that they're in places where they can be subjected to violence, is a legacy of the genocide, right? Because those communities came from genocide diaspora groups. If you look at where anti-Semitism happens, and I'm just using these two groups because I think probably people are fairly knowledgeable of them. If you look at where that happens in the world today, some of the places that happens is because people had to go as refugees from, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and so forth, and are now in smaller communities, more vulnerable communities, right? Where anti-Semitism can have an effect, right? And so those kinds of issues I think are really important. And so we can get into more, there are more dimensions of this. Also demographically, and this is where we get into really complicated territory, right? In philosophy circles, there are sort of debates about different kinds of ethical systems. And one problem that a lot of them share is they're not very good at dealing with the past when it conflicts with, the sort of demographics of the present. A very easy way to see that is if you talk about Native American land claims, or Armenian land claims, or any other land claims by genocided groups that are significantly smaller than when genocide was committed against them. The easy argument in that case is that any kind of reparations disadvantages unfairly people who had nothing to do with the genocide originally, right? So Native Americans, right? If we give back, if we ever started enforcing our treaties, I think that's about half of the US territory legally belongs to Native Americans today. Don't quote me on that, but that's stuff I've read. I'm not an expert on this, but that if you just were to enforce US law, half of the land would be Native American. And clearly we don't do that, right? We don't enforce those laws. We don't enforce those treaties, which are the law of the land, right? And we also find ways to manipulate, after the treaties and so forth, right? The irony, of course, is that Native Americans were stereotyped as always going back, Indian giver and things like that, right? The Indian givers were obviously, the U.S. government and others, right, who were taking back everything that we gave, every opportunity we could get. But if you look at the sort of enforcement of those kinds of obligations, right, and the legacies that are entailed with that, you can see the sort of inequalities that persist. I think I'll stop there just because I can go on more about this, but I'll hold that. Okay. Give other.
I saw how you said.
Let me to start with a little correction. Everything is okay. Today is Independence Day of Armenia. But more correctly, being historically precise, today is the day when 26 years ago, the only time Armenian population in Armenia voted freely and fair. Because the declaration was made 2 days after, in September 23. But this is the day when people voted without any forgery or pressure or buying votes. They went to the stations and they voted. Some of them voted against independence, by the way, 4 or 3%, if I remember correctly. Well, now about independence and dependence. I'm trying to link this date with the previous section, which is another alert for all of us. And Armenia also involved in a way, directly or non-directly. It is also related to prevention alert, some kind of. Neo-Stalinism, praising Stalinist legacy, or in other words, rehabilitation of Stalin as a strong man, as a model and icon. The thing which is going on in Russia intensively. And the signs we follow in Armenia. I personally was involved in a Mikoyan statute when I voted against, and it was a public debate on this, and they stopped. Mikoyan, who signed and asked permission for extra quotas for killing squads, to kill Armenians, being in Yerevan. Now, in Yerevan, a week ago, closed an exhibition condemning Stalinist repression. This year is 18th anniversary, when 30,000 Armenians were killed. This was the largest killing after the genocide, and the second massacre of Armenian intelligentsia. Charens, Bakuns, they were killed 8 years ago. So we have no idea where their ashes are, their remain. So now, this in terms of dependence. So this is another dangerous alert for us, dangerous development, when we have to follow, we are forced because of status of geopolitical hostage to follow the praising and rehabilitation of Stalin, a person who is one of the bloodiest in the world history. But statues are back in Russia, and the president there say, quote, "Those who target and demonize Stalin, it's striking Russia and Soviet Union." So it was set in June this year. So now we follow, another example for my personal case. In December, being member of Armenian Ministry of Transportation and Communication, being responsible for voting what kind of stamp to issue, I offered to make a stamp block, big stamp, in memory of victims of Stalinist repressions. It was voted, it was confirmed, it was included in the list. Now if you follow High Post, Armenian Post, it is excluded as politically dangerous. So those are the things I want to share, and my article will be published. It's not the advertisement, what I said. My article will be published as a column in the next issue of Armenian Mirror Spectator.
This side of the room. Okay. All right, then I've got one more general topic, and then we'll open it up, okay? We all embrace the idea that increased education and awareness about historical cases of genocide and current occurrences of genocide will lead to prevention of future genocide. However, if we were to chart in parallel the development of genocide studies and education over the past, say, 40 years, and the occurrence of genocide over the past 40 years or so, it doesn't look like the trend is in the direction that we might hope it would be. I want you to explain this. No, but I mean, how do we account for this, Heather?
I'll explain the failure of a working class revolution in World War I. I can.
I mean, I guess what it all boils down to is, what is the role of scholars and scholarship in real life terms of prevention?
Okay. Let me say two things. First of all, when we're dealing with counterfactuals, one of the problems is we don't know what the situation would be without that education and efforts, right? So it's possible that we're actually seeing less genocide than we would have otherwise, right? And it's possible. I mean, I do think, I mentioned East Timor, I think there are cases where, there have been positive international developments where bad things could have happened. I think that's true. And we're also seeing, I mean, you can certainly argue that we are seeing a period of political extremism at a normalized national level that we haven't quite seen in quite a while. People are really drawing comparisons to the 1920s and 30s. I'm not sure, that's exactly the right comparison. I'm also not sure that we don't see this at different points. But in the face of that may be so much pressure towards genocide that there, even significant gains are sort of, not going to be adequate. So I'd say that first thing. But then there's another disturbing thing that comes in, which is, I had written some years ago looking at the phenomenon of denial and what people sometimes, Isaac Charney called this like denial, what did he call it? Denialism, I can't remember. But it's the idea where, a definitionalism, where you just start playing around with the definition of genocide and debating it so that you'd never have to actually deal with human rights problems, right? And in that context, I actually argued that the Serb leadership in pursuing genocide in Bosnia and elsewhere was really well aware of both international law at the time on genocide and how that law was applied and not applied, particularly not applied, right? And if you look at a lot of the Serbian calculations, they were based on looking at previous ways in which Cambodia, East Timor, whatever, I don't know that they'd study those particular cases, but ways in which international law was ineffective. And also, I think that the way that they carried out genocide was particularly focused on ways that were most immune, even though they were internationally illegal and they miscalculated, were most immune to prosecution. And that's why I think they used, for instance, sexual violence and displacement and other types of forms that really are part of a genocidal process, rather than direct killing, to the extent that, in Rwanda and Armenian Genocide, you see more direct killing percentage-wise against against the population. But they were very calculated in what they did. So the question comes up, has improvement in international law, and even some improvements in enforcement, just created a context in which perpetrators just get smarter about how they do things, right? And I think we can ask a parallel question with that. As, for instance, just look at the United States, right? So women, let's not pretend that we have gender equality in the United States, or we've had it at any point. Probably the 1830s was probably, our high point or something, before we had industrialization and things changed. But, it's also hard to argue that we haven't had some significant progress over the last 50 years, say, around gender issues in the United States. Now, some people, and I think you can see this, right, that part of the result of that, and Susan Faludi wrote a book, I think 1986, I want to say, called Backlash, which sort of got our attention on this, right? That you could argue that part of the fuel for sort of the movement in the United States, the sort of anti-human rights movement in the United States that's getting so public, is the success of, say, women's liberation isn't maybe the right term, but political progress by, say, women, okay? I think you see this with a very fast change in the status of GLBT issues and people in the United States, really a 10-year sort of revolution, right? And the backlash that's come now that we're seeing against that. And so it does raise the problem that when you have forward movements in a society, unless you're figuring out ways to change, to really at a deep level change values across that society, the potential for people to hold on to very, very repressive views against the progress that's been made is still there. And they can be tapped. I think what happened in the United States to an extent is they got tapped in the political process and their voices came out. I think the problem in the US was that was linked to very real economic dislocation and I would say oppression. That people were hurting economically and at the same time had not gone through a process of dealing with a lot of these really problematic ideas. And so when those two things could be put together, you could get a political backlash movement like we're seeing today. It's different in different societies, the way those dynamics play. And I would ask those who are experts, Taner is someone who obviously is an expert on contemporary Turkey. But you could argue that Erdogan, some of his popularity has to do with a lot of the gains that were made in the 90s and 2000s in Turkey around democratization, around indigenous issues, particularly Kurdish issues, and not indigenous, I shouldn't say that, Kurdish issues, around other kinds of issues where there were moments of real change, hope, and so forth. And then you get a movement that sort of shuts that down, in part by changing the Constitution, which makes it impossible for those people who have maybe more popular appeal to as easily affect positively the political situation. So that's my concern. Now, in the long run, does that mean that we're now going to change attitudes? And this gets to a very subtle issue, I think, and I'll sort of end the answer on this. A very subtle issue about how fixed people's political ideas are. And this is where I get very worried. This is where I start to think symbolic things, political leadership, what people say really matters. Because it may be the case that if in our educational system, in our political system, people are hearing consistent messages of respect, human rights, civil rights, and so forth, that will sort of push people in the right direction. I'm not saying they're passive, I'm not saying anything like that, but it will make it, that part of themselves that's given over to those kinds of views, accepted and sort of go. Those same people might very easily shift in a different direction in other contexts. I can see that in myself, right, depending on the circumstances. And I'm not, I don't think any of us are immune to that. And so when they're hearing something very different, right, the same person with the same ethical values and so forth can shift in a different direction, a negative direction. And I think as people, we're a lot more malleable than we think we are. I'm not saying we're passive. I'm not saying we can't do anything about it. But I am saying that I think it's hard to say you have one character, one set of values, and you'll never get moved off them. And this isn't even simply about threat. It's not about intimidation. It's not about those kinds of things. It's just that taking ethical stands, taking political stands is a very complicated psychological process, and we can't assume that that people, you know, once people are sort of good, once they're doing the right thing, that that's somehow embedded and will never change. And that's my real worry in the United States, is we're getting a culture where real valuing of denigration of people, of targeting of weakness. I mean, attacks on people who are differently able is a huge part of, I think, something we've seen in the last couple of years. And that, you know, has its resonance with the Holocaust, but really speaks to a certain kind of attitude of targeting people who are vulnerable in the society, and people who historically have been targeted. And so if that becomes okay, so people feel like it's okay, I mean, you know, I think there's a real danger, and that's my biggest worry right now going forward. On that optimistic note.
So I have 17 more questions, but what I want to actually do is just open it up, and anybody who would like to ask a question or a comment on.
And can I add, you can talk to one another, because as I said, there's real expertise in here, much more, you know, I happen to be sitting up here, so I'm saying all this stuff. Thank you for letting me do that. But, you know, really, if we get a dialogue, because the questions that have been raised are very fundamental. And I think what we do as people, not just people in this room, but how we affect what's outside this room, it has significance in the broader context that we're living in. So, you know, it doesn't have to go through me and Mark.
It has to go through me.
It has to go through Mark, but that's because he's special.
Question about the process. I guess you're a philosophy department, but within the philosophy department, but historically, at least over 40 years, starting 1950s forward, the Armenian Genocide, the community started trusting that academic research to just, you know, trying to establish every university, starting with Harvard and UCLA, and then trying to come up with every other university. A chair of Armenian studies and Armenian genocide should be studied as an Armenian genocide by scholars largely for some time were only Armenian or largely Armenians, somewhat. But now, you know, it's been discussed. More has been done outside of those departments, and having a chair or having a department from academic endeavor, do you see it from, or to discuss it from international relations, let's say?
No, I understand the question.
Diplomacy.
So this would be a great point for other people to participate, because this is a political football. Let me say this. Great Armenian Genocide Chair, Richard Hovnessian, excellent. I'm not going to comment specifically on different chairs, you know, the sort of Armenian Studies movement, but you're not an Armenian Studies chair, right?
No, I'm the only person who does Armenian history, has a chair, but the
It's not
chair
Armenian.
comes from something else.
Put her work against anybody, okay? So it's not a chair that was set up for Armenian Studies, it's somebody who is so good at what she did that Armenian studies became part of the curriculum at MIT. Fair to say?
Yeah.
Not to embarrass you, but, you
No,
know,
no,
so
not the
I,
second part is great.
okay. So, you know, and Tanner was not an Armenian study, he was a scholar who was really respected and then came late to this particular position. And I think that if you look at the people who have had a huge impact in Armenian, on the Armenian genocide issue, you see two things. One is, for the most part, they didn't go through some more traditional sort of Armenian chair situation, right? Not saying you shouldn't get it. If you get a chair, great, you should do it. And so, you know, but I think that connects to the second thing. I think our most, you know, if you're looking at the Armenian genocide, the most effective work is by people who know something beyond the Armenian genocide. Just like what happened with the Holocaust a couple decades, started happening with the Holocaust, where you had something of a split. I mean, there are people who still just do Holocaust studies, but you see, you know, even Debord, who's I think is just an amazing scholar of the Holocaust, is heavily informed by other cases of genocide. So people in the Armenian, you know, if you're doing Armenian genocide studies and you don't know Sudan, for instance, you know, at some level, you're missing important aspects of the work that you can be doing. Or, you know, maybe in Leonard's case, you don't know identity studies, right? Is that fair to say? You know, and gender studies and things like that. You know, Tanner has all sorts of political and economic background, right? So if you don't know something beyond just Armenian studies and Armenian genocide studies, you're not able to understand, I think, the Armenian case, both on its own and in its historical context, and I think that's also crucial. I mean, honestly, I'm Armenian, and I don't want to hear people talk about the Armenian genocide alone anymore, right, as an isolated case, and oh my God, we're the worst victims in history and all that. That's not the case, and it's also not productive in the 21st century. That's talking to ourselves, okay? And some, you know, kid in the Belmont public schools who has no connection to Armenians is not going to care about something that happened 100 years ago, no matter how much we tell them it matters for Armenians in the Republic today or anything like that, if it's not linked to a broader history of human rights abuse that makes sense to them. And I'm not saying that the Armenian genocide is not relevant. Don't get me wrong. I think it's really important. But it's in a context. And that's partly why I am involved with IAGS, and I'm really not very present, with the exception of NAASR and some work with Zorian, with Armenian studies as a discipline. That's not where I've ever been, and I respect a lot of the work people have done. It's not where I could ever have done the work that I've done for whatever value it has. But if you look at what NAASR has done, and I'm thinking going back to like the Facing History Ourselves, if you just remember that program at Belmont High School, which was all about multiple cases of mass violence, right? So you see NAASR, you see Zorian, particularly as two organizations that have really understood the importance of connection and moving out, right? And NAASR has a complicated thing because it's got an Armenian studies base, but it's also doing this work on in genocide studies and human rights and so forth. But I think that's absolutely crucial. So I would say that IAGS is really useful because if you're an Armenian-focused genocide scholar, and there are a lot of them, you'll never, I mean, even panels-wise, you won't be in environments where you can only talk about that to people who are only talking about that issue. You're going to have to be crossing over. And people are going to be challenging you if you're not able to make some connections or look at things in a complicated way. Yes.
Actually, that kind of leads right into what I was going to ask you about, or actually just discuss. Coming from Rhode Island, where we just last year were able to successfully pass a law requiring Holocaust and genocide studies in the state schools, one of the things that we found out through a collaborative committee was that we needed to work within a group that didn't just focus on the Armenian genocide. The reason the legislation, we feel, was successful this time around, because we've tried this for a long time, obviously, actually since the year 2000 when Aaron Gardinian, you know, successfully got legislation passed just to develop curriculum materials. But since then, the reason we really feel this was successful this time is because it was a community-wide committee that consisted of people from the Jewish community, the African American community, the Southeast Asian community, the Armenian community, and we all worked together in order to develop this legislation, lobby with our legislators, and be successful in the pursuit of these studies. And Esther and I have always believed, since we started this work, that we needed to focus on all genocides, but use the Armenian, because the Armenian genocide was what it was, educationally speaking, back when we first started, we made that our primary case, obviously. But the comparisons between the genocides were inevitable. And one of the things that we focused on as a group in implementing genocide studies is the 10 stages of genocide and how Stan's 10 stages of genocide. But you know, when you bring that up with students, it resonates with them because they start to think about, oh, you know, this is something that's happening all over. And your concern about genocide studies and where it's going in terms of being effective, as Marc said, you know, we present it in a way so that we don't want this ever to happen again. That's how we present it to our students. It's how our students relate to it. But at the same time, they get frustrated because now, especially, they're hearing the rhetoric that creates this environment. And so they're wondering, what can we do? And how can we be effective in combating this type of situation? They look at the stages and go, okay, we have classification going on. We have discrimination going on. We have racism going on. We have all of this going on. Dehumanization in so many instances going on. The only thing that we don't have, and even that, through social media and through the various hate groups, the organization even is sort of starting to be there. So the students become, our students become very concerned. Then anxiety sets in, and this feeling of powerlessness against the powers that be, and that's a difficult thing for us to overcome. How do we overcome that with our students and give them something to do? Because as educators, you know that students want to be able to act. We want to be able to act, but students in particular want to be able to take action. And so, you know, aside from marches and demonstrations,
you asked many
questions.
questions.
I know.
So to go back through, I mean, one thing I would say in connecting the Armenian genocide, I think if you go back to that case, we'll go back to that case because many people have a personal connection, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at when you're reading a memoir, right, and you think, I think when I was a kid, I used to dream that I could take helicopters back in time and save people or something like that. You know? You get these ideas of, why didn't somebody do something? Why couldn't I want to go back? I would have done something, right? Well, the first thing to say is, we can't do anything about what happened then, but we can certainly do things about today. So if that's one, if somebody gets that as a lesson from studying the Armenian genocide, which it sounds like they're getting, because they're seeing stuff, right? If you've never studied genocide before, and somebody says to you, oh, those are just like those neo-Nazi, they're just, you know, sort of a little upset, but it's not a big deal, and those counter-protesters are really just angry people too, and, you know, just ignore all that stuff, right? If you've never looked at the history of a genocide before, okay, that sounds fine, you know, no big, you know, I'll just go back to my video games and everything's fine, right? But as soon as you've studied it, suddenly a red flag goes up and you're saying, well, wait a minute, I've seen this kind of rhetoric before. I've seen this kind of thing. So right there, you've got a potential to change the sort of citizenry or the citizen and residency or whatever, you know, in terms of, you know, how people vote, how they voice their discontent, how they deal with peers who might be going down that road, which we should never underestimate, right? That peer-to-peer thing can stop violence from happening on the ground where it really happens. So I would say that. But I would also say that, and again, I'm going to sound like the crotchety old guy. I was making fun of myself a little bit about the anti-technology. This is going to be the other side of it. Activism, changing society, is not clicking a like button on something. That doesn't change anything. It doesn't do anything. It can, you know, I'm not saying don't do it. I just had a discussion with a journalist I know about whether doing all these online petitions that have come up has any effect at all. Do they just get ignored? You know, do you want to spend half an hour a day? Because you can easily do that on this petition, that petition, whatever. Maybe they don't have any effect. It's better spent otherwise, right? So you have to be very, you know, so maybe that's where, like, it's easy when things are going to take some work to say, my God, I can't do anything. Also, one of the things we have to be very sensitive to for people, I will say, in the 8 to 28-year-old range right now is the way that they're being educated is meant to keep them from doing anything else and be scared all the time about their future. I know, does that sound familiar, right? You have to be worried about everything. You have to be worried if you're in college, whether you're going to get a job. When you're in high school, you have to be doing 8 million things because you're worried that you won't get into college. When you're in, and I'm not joking, when you're in 3rd grade, you've got to be worried about how are you going to be in the next 2 years and this and that, right? So we've created an educational culture that doesn't allow students to develop independently outside of the structure, I think. And a lot of the students who do that pay a price in terms of grades, behavior, claims, and all sorts of stuff, right? So we have a big problem in that way. I think that's where the problem comes, so that what probably students are expressing is, my God, this is enough. I can't even, I'm worried about I'm worried about having enough to eat in 20 years because I know how bad the economy could be, and if I don't follow this path, I'm going to be in trouble. And everyone's telling me that, and my teachers are telling me, and everyone's worried about this. And now this thing comes along that I really care about, and there is literally no time in the day, I'm getting told if I don't play soccer and, basically tear my ACL by overdoing it at age 10, I have no future, right? And so how do we change that culture? Because I think political activism does take time. I mean, there's a joke, Nehru, Nehru, who was one of the leaders of the Indian independence movement, he and others used to joke in India that they used to like going to jail because that's when they could get work done, because they had no other time otherwise. And I don't mean to make light of going to jail, because I know those who have been there, I don't mean to. But they actually were forced out of all the work that they were doing, and all they could do was write. And the Brits were stupid to let them write, but that's another set of issues. But so how do we create as educators? And I think about this a lot in terms of how much homework do you assign? I think we assign 2 hours of homework, anything more than that is a waste educationally. It's counterproductive. The evidence is in. Yet we assign like crazy to, I think the rule that you should use is 10 minutes times the grade level through 12th grade. Yeah. And anything more than that is counterproductive. You actually are hurting students. And nobody pays attention to it because teachers are worried about the test scores, and they're worried, nobody wants to take that step, right? But political movement happens because people have the time to talk. They're not being regimented. I'm going to throw out a Foucault moment here, but they're not being in a system that disciplines them constantly. So there is actually no place in which they are free to think about and act on the ethical reflections that they're doing, or they don't even have time to reflect ethically, right?
But then the other issue is
so
when you
that's what I'm
try to
saying.
have a discussion with them, they don't know how to have a discussion. So
But
that's
that's
the
us.
other issue.
That's our fault.
Well, yeah, that's true. That's true.
I mean,
it is. Because
I
I'll
yeah.
speak in front of a class and I'll say, okay, now,
Yeah.
and present all kinds of, the right kinds
Yeah.
of questions to encourage discourse, and then it becomes problematic
Right,
in terms of
right.
creating that.
So we have to think of new ways to do this. One example that I'll give from my university is that we have talks, right? Somebody talks for 45 minutes and then you have half an hour for questions.
Right.
And all the students, or many of the students, leave after the talk because they're used to being told you listen to the lecture and then you don't. And the idea of actually challenging someone, disagreeing, doing other things is a loss. So, but that's our fault because we created this educational system. We've created this society. It's not their fault. They're plugged into it from a young age. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say for young people, not school-age kids, but young people, maybe college-age kids, I actually think what's going on right now with all this hate that's out there is actually an accelerator, a very good accelerator. Because forget about all the formal things and all, how do you get them to act? Just being present, just reacting, not necessarily acting. To my mind, it's a very good thing. The conversations now versus 10 years ago, when everything was hunky-dory, it was all hidden. There was a lot of racism, there was a lot of hate, and people didn't talk about it, and people didn't address it. Now, I work at a company that has nothing to do with politics, and we have town meetings, and people talk about Trump, they talk about Colin Kaepernick, they talk like they're asking me questions of my opinions on these things. And so we have young people who are coming to work for us that are in their mid-20s, early 20s that want to know what our organization thinks about these issues. So to my mind, there's a in-between step between political activism in awareness. And I think we had a time where it was all hidden behind the shadows, and there was no awareness, and we didn't really think, oh, Americans were racist, or Americans were haters, or Americans. Someone knew it, but it never came out. So I think this is allowing an acceleration into maturing as a country, hopefully, and not going in that direction and not taking that in. But you know, it might be a favor. It might be a favor in terms of exposing conversation that didn't happen before. So that's the way I see it.
I hope so. I hope you're absolutely right. I hope so.
And just to add, like, sort of a, I don't know if we call it sort of a Buddhist moment, but not doing something can be actually really, if we could get our society just not to attack vulnerable people, something like that, and maybe that's part of what happens as well, is that people get educated. Maybe they're not out there changing other people in a huge, you know, like a public way, you know, through media or something, but they may be having an effect on peers and not doing the things that in another context they might have done. So the kind of thing you're saying, those conversations can be really productive. I agree, yeah.
Dare we end on a positive note?
Yes.
We had a student question.
Sorry,
yeah.
I'll just make a really quick point, just to go off of that. Every day, I'm a political science major, so every day I find myself in a lot of heated discussions in the classroom, and I think they actually help us a lot, because when someone makes a comment, we analyze why they think that way, or how they came to that conclusion, which helps us understand more about others in the world and how we can change things in the end, or just, we understand what's happening in the world more by having that open discussion. So just to go off of that a little, I think it's very helpful in the classroom.
And you also get to see neo-Nazis parade, which is very different from reading, I don't say that's a positive thing, but it's very different from reading about it as if it's part of a history that you have no connection to. You know, we have a connection to what's happening. It's hot, I know it's horrible, but to follow the note of at least people are responding, and I think you're right, people are responding, and that's a great point. There's a lot of, I mean, people are having political discussions. I grew up during the Reagan period, and nobody had political, I mean, we had discussions about MTV, that was about it, you know, when they actually had music videos. Nobody had political discussion. I mean, people did have political discussions, but my generation, that wasn't a big thing. You didn't hang out with friends and debate whether you saw Nazism rising in the US or not. And I think that's happening a lot more. And I think you're right, that's
You
a
didn't
that's an
Snapchat on
important
your
thing.
rotary phone?
You
What's that? Yeah.
You called on your rotary phone and you talked about MTV. That was it.
One positive thing is we can plan ahead to meet and actually show up and not have to keep changing it through texting. I didn't call you, you're in that crappy town next door. We grew up in towns, rival towns next to each other.
I was wondering if this has come up in your studies, but if you look at global warming and you believe that the oceans are going to rise and displace millions of acres around the world, and displace millions of people around the world, and countries not being able to deal with the population shift, do you see the possibility of genocide as a solution with some countries that don't know how to deal with the population shift?
There goes our happy ending, George.
Yeah. No, as I said, people make that argument in terms of Sudan and other cases, that scarce resources that have been partly triggered by climate change. You also have island, I mean, it's not going to happen, it's happening. Sea levels rising in island, you know, Fiji or someplace like that. I mean, this is a serious contemporary problem that people are facing, the storms, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, add pressure to human, you know, existence, and of course that can exacerbate political issues, particularly when scapegoating, anti-immigrant blaming, and things like that is in fashion, right? If it's not in fashion, then maybe you say, wow, it's the environment, we need to do something about it. But if you're worried about a bunch of storms, and then you see, you know, then somebody gives you a really easy thing that you can do, go beat up some immigrants, and then that'll cure the problem. Some people are going to do that, right? Instead of tackling the much more difficult problems that are really causing these issues. So I say that is an issue. Yeah, all those kinds of issues. Yeah,
that notwithstanding, please applaud for Mitch.
Thank you for great comments and questions. And
yes, thank you, audience, for being here and taking part in this. There are refreshments. Please stick around.
No, we got